You awoke, wrapped in the damp shadow of a cramped shelter, the heavy air thick with mixed scents, aged sweat, yellowed newspaper, and the faint metallic trace of rust. The hard floor beneath your tired body was an uneasy patchwork of creaking boards and shredded paper, barely muffling the cold that seeped in slowly, insistently. As you rose with caution, you felt the weight of silence pressing against the thin walls all around, where dozens of held breaths mingled in a slow, almost inaudible rhythm. Your space measured mere millimeters, cluttered with piled belongings and rough fabrics that tickled your weary skin, constant reminders of the compressed life you had come to seek. When you straightened the scant blanket, the bitter smell of undercooked rice drifted up from the communal kitchens, signaling the repetitive day ahead. Endless lines for rationed food, muted footsteps on creaking stairs, muffled whispers trying to fill the void of invisible isolation. The approach of the moment to present yourself at the shelter's registry weighed heavily in your chest, a ritual of silent surveillance that might decide your fate. You felt the burden of invisibility in this new land, where survival was a slow, steady, and painfully silent exercise. Did the world outside remember you existed, or had it already lost interest while you lay here, swallowed by shadows? Post-war Japan, an overcrowded island, haunted by its past, where the silent burden of refugees filled every cramped corner. The cold light, filtered through narrow, grimy windows, offered no comfort, just the faint gray of forgotten mornings. You touched the rough fabric of your thin shirt, the threads prickling against your skin, and listened to the soft hiss of distant voices, punctuated by the occasional groan of the building settling into itself. Compared to the constant buzz and endless choice of the modern world you sometimes remembered, a world of soft beds, clean streets, and overwhelming noise, this quiet was oppressive, but strangely meditative. You thought bitterly how here, even a cough had to be measured, silenced almost out of respect or fear. Filling your lungs, you stood and turned slowly to the narrow corridor. Each step was deliberate, the boards creaking underfoot like a whispered reminder of fragility. You noted the chill seeping into your toes, the faint scent of vinegar and old wood mingling with the sticky humidity. The same routine awaited. Queue for food, maintain silence, navigate the eyes that watched without speaking. You checked the door latch again, pressing your palm to the cold metal, turning it left, then right, confirming it was locked tight. Twice, 3 times. The ritual became a slow rhythm, a mantra to center your restless mind. Suddenly, a hush fell over the shelter. You paused, breath caught, as a shift rippled through the stillness, a collective, unseen glance passing between corners. The soft but unmistakable sound of a door closing quietly echoed down the hall, sharp in the quiet. Something was quietly unfolding beyond your fragile bubble of silence. Something urgent, yet unspoken. The tension in the thin air grew, thicker and more oppressive, before Morpheus claims you entirely. Make sure you're still subscribed. For some, the button vanished, and I wouldn't want you to miss the next bedtime stories. Take a moment and leave a pillow-soft like. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Your presence keeps this little corner of calm alive. Thanks for being part of it. A quiet ripple spread through the cramped shelter, like a gentle, unseen wave brushing against the walls that held you in. Your breath lingered in your chest, a slow, steady drum, as the faint sound of the door closing slipped past the layers of silence like a soft exhale. The emptiness around you seemed to pulse, thin, fragile, breathing tension, and yet you remained rooted in place, the cold pressed against your skin, a slow creep of chill climbing your spine. You moved cautiously, each motion deliberate and drawn out. The worn floorboards groaned beneath your weight, folding into the quiet, like an old confession whispered just for yourself. Your fingers brushed along the edge of the blanket, tangled around you, the fabric rough and uneven, a tangible reminder of this compressed existence. You slid your hand toward the door, pressing your palm once more against the cold metal latch. The chill seeped through your skin, stubborn and unforgiving, even as your heart echoed a rhythm steady enough to challenge the thick unease lodged in the air. As your fingers traced the outline of the latch, the shelter seemed to hold its breath with you. Somewhere beyond the thin walls, a group shifted restlessly. The faint scuff of shoes and whispered murmurs threading through the darkness. You let your gaze drift toward the narrow corridor, barely a strip of light revealing the cracked plaster and shadowed corners where memories seemed to settle like dust. The scent there was sharp and musty, vinegar and something distant, almost like the brittle scent of charred paper. A slow shudder ran through your legs as you rose, every joint stiff and protesting after hours of stillness. The thin fabric of your shirt caught softly against your skin as you adjusted the scant blanket again, feeling the uneven weight of it like a shield, worn but necessary. Your eyes caught the faint outline of a crushed newspaper, folded against the wall, yellowed and curled at the edges, telling silent stories you could no longer read but felt all the same. Todays and yesterdays folded together in this quiet place. You stepped forward, and your feet met the floor with muted insistence. Each step was rehearsed and elongated, as if the world outside depended on your silence alone. The air was thick and dense, the mixed scent of sweat, old wood, and something faintly sour, lingering like a presence. You passed other narrow sleeping spaces, where bodies stirred lightly beneath scattered blankets, the rise and fall of breath marking a fragile rhythm of survival. Ahead, The low hum of voices drifted through the slivers of light, piercing the grime on the windows. They were soft, cautious, words tethered to routine. The murmur of names called in turn, the shuffle of footsteps on cracked linoleum, the scraping of bowls patiently, waiting for rationed rice. The scent of undercooked grains hovered faintly, bitter and familiar, entwined with the sharp sting of stale tobacco smoke. You paused by the door at the end of the corridor, a thin barrier between this shadowed refuge and the wider, stranger world pressing beyond. Your hand reached out, trembling just slightly, to grip the worn wooden handle. The grain beneath your fingers was rough, splintered in places from years of anxious palms seeking comfort or control. The door held a weight rooted deep in its frame, resisting your quiet pressure. A moment stretched between heartbeats, heavy and fluid, as a sudden shuffling sound came from just beyond. Your breath caught, shallow and deliberate, pulling the dull ache from your lungs. Somewhere near, a figure moved, slow and deliberate. You sensed rather than saw, the faint edge of menace hanging low in the air. No threat screamed, no. Harsh voices rose, just the persistent tension of eyes unseen, watching beneath heavy lids. Your gaze flicked back to the latch, recalling the ritual you practiced, the slow twists left then right, twice, then thrice, an echo in your mind meant to anchor you. You leaned in slightly, listening to the faint rhythm of the shelter settling, the occasional creak, the whisper of cloth shifting. Somewhere above, a distant chime rang out briefly, a bell tolling the hour, somber and hollow, slicing through the hush like a muted harbinger. For a brief second, a fragment of warmth brushed your face, a slender ray of pale sunlight slipping timidly through the grime, casting a muted glow over the dust motes dancing, slow and weightless. It was an unwelcome reminder of the outside world, of days not yet lived, suspended in this paused moment. You sank into the quiet glow, feeling the sharp edge of hope, flicker soft and thin before retreating. The corridor beyond the door yawned wide, swallowed in shadows so dark they seemed to pulse with their own slow heartbeat. You knew that beyond this threshold waited the registry, the endless line of muted faces and hushed footsteps, the silent test of patience beneath watchful eyes. The thoughts settled heavy over your chest, a weight you had grown to bear steadily, carefully. A low murmur rose again, rippling through the shelter like a tide retreating and advancing. Somewhere close, a cough fought its way through the silence, careful, stifled, an urgent reminder of all the fragility pressed against these walls. You swallowed the knot tightening in your throat and stepped forward, slow and measured. Your footsteps merged with the familiar rhythm of this place, soft echoes against cracked plaster, the subtle scuff of worn shoes on tiled floors. The distant path was narrow, lined with faces, blurred by shadow and distance, all moving forward in quiet determination. You felt the weight of unspoken stories pressed close, the faint shiver of collective breath beneath the tethered hush. At the entrance of the registry room, you paused, your pulse a steady drumstick against ribs that yearned for stillness. The doorframe trembled slightly under your touch, cold and solid, but behind it whispered a presence more elusive, more demanding. The sheltered hush cracked for a heartbeat, and then you heard it, a whisper, almost swallowed by the settling dust. A name. Not yours, but close enough to stir the air. You pressed your palm to the door once more, the familiar chill seeping deep into your skin. The faintest creak followed, and for a moment the world balanced on a fragile hinge. Quiet, waiting, holding its breath. Then the door cracked open slowly, letting in a sliver of gray light that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. You glanced inside, and in that narrow ribbon of shadow and silence, a figure met your gaze, eyes sharp and unreadable. And in that long, endless moment, you realized the next step was no longer just about survival. You hesitated at the threshold, your palms still pressed to the cold wood, the grain rough and splintered beneath your fingertips. The dim light slipped inside like a cautious visitor, brushing the dust motes adrift in the stale air. Your breath was slow, careful, as if yielding to the gravity that the silence exerted. The figure inside met your gaze, a flicker of questions in their eyes, sharp and unreadable, frozen in the gray space between you. They said nothing. The room itself swallowed words before they had a chance to escape. Behind that fragile barrier, the registry room breathed. A different air, a murmur of restrained movement and soft rustling, like secrets floating just beneath the surface. Your senses sharpened to each detail. The faint scrape of footsteps on worn linoleum echoed patiently, carrying the weight of countless others before you. The scent of boiled rice lingered faintly, mingled with a sharper undertone of disinfectant and the sour tang of damp fabric. You could almost taste the mixture in the air, bitter and familiar, pressing against your tongue. The figure's eyes held steady as you stepped inside, the door sighing closed behind you with a reluctant finality. The chilled air bit warmly at exposed skin beneath the thin shirt, and you pulled the blanket tighter around your shoulders. Every motion was careful, extended, as if there was nowhere for your haste to reside here. You felt the hollow drag of time, stretching and folding, thick and slow, as your feet carried you further into the dim room. Around you, faces blurred into a tapestry of weariness, eyes cast downward or fixed on some intangible point beyond walls and windows. The quiet was a shared breath held too long, a collective expectation simmering beneath the surface. You moved past the scattered clatter of metal bowls and the faint crinkle of ration tickets, your fingers grazing the worn edges as you passed. The sound was stifled but persistent, the subtle creak of a chair drawing back, the soft crackle of scrap paper shifting beneath a restless hand. You found a space near the back, the floor scarred with years of these slow, stifling meetings. The weight of countless silent stories pressed into the faded linoleum beneath you as you settled down on the edge of a battered bench. The cold seeped through the thin fabric beneath your skin, grounding you in the present, with its persistent ache around you. Whispers curled and flickered, names called in gentle sequences. The soft responses carried on breaths measured as if they might shatter under louder sound. The ritual unfolded in an unhurried rhythm, a dance of survival in muted tones. You glanced toward the small window near the ceiling, where a sliver of pale light struggled through layers of grime to catch the dust swirling slowly like frozen breath. You traced the fragile patterns, tiny motes afloat, and felt the quiet pressing insistently against your eardrums. The chair beneath you groaned softly as you shifted weight, the fabric rough against your legs. Your hands rested lightly on the blanket, the rough edges catching between your fingers again and again, weaving an unspoken tension between focus and fatigue. You could hear the distant shuffle of footsteps weaving through the room's narrow aisles, each step swallowed gently by worn floorboards and hushed anticipation. Your breath hollowed out sharply, rubbing away the moisture clouding your lungs, as a distant bell tolled, low, somber, weighted with the passing of hours you no longer measured by calendars. The sound reverberated, sinking slowly, drawing a faint shiver through the thin walls. Somewhere beyond, a cough emerged, sharp and stifled, blending quickly back into the pervasive quiet. You caught the scent of stale tobacco trailing through the air, tremble subtly beneath their presence, a ripple moving through the collective stillness. All eyes seemed to narrow, the tension focused and folded inward as the unspoken shifted the air's weight. You resisted the urge to look back, anchoring yourself to the rhythm of your own breath, slow and steady. Time dragged, stretched thin and pliable, as moments melted into each other. You checked the blanket again, its familiar roughness against your skin a fragile comfort, a shield against the cold that lingered not just outside the walls, but in the spaces between each measured breath. Suddenly, the figure who had greeted you stepped forward. Their face caught the weak overhead light, revealing eyes that held something deeper than mere observation, an echo of hope, or perhaps a warning. Their hand extended slowly, a silent invitation, or a cautious test. You hesitated, the weight of the moment settling like dust on your shoulders. You reached out, fingertips brushing the worn palm, a fragile bridge across the vast silence. The contact was brief but charged, a spark hidden beneath the careful stillness of this place. The air seemed to pulse, thinner, sharper, as the whispered murmur of a name nearly caught on lips nearby. Behind the walls, the shelter held its breath again. The tension, once a distant murmur, pressed harder now, a slow, tightening coil wrapped around your chest, a reminder that this place was more than refuge or prison. It was a threshold, a crossing point where fate waited patiently in the shadows. You stepped back, the weight of the unknown settling heavy but oddly familiar. The door ahead, a simple barrier of wood and dust, remained closed between what was and what might be. And as you turned slowly toward the narrow corridor, the faint echo of a whispered name tugged at the edges of your mind, soft and persistent. The next step was no longer simply a passage through space. It was the unfolding of something far more fragile, poised between shadow and light, waiting quietly to be claimed. You stepped back from the door, your palm lingering on the cold wood a moment longer than expected, the rough grain pressing faint scratches into your skin. The air behind you felt heavier now, as though the very silence had deepened its roots, tightening its grip upon the narrow confines of the shelter. The muted murmurs beyond the walls seemed to fade, swallowed by the thick tension that wrapped you like a second skin. You felt the slow, dragging weight of anticipation settle across your shoulders, a burden not of force, but of quiet inevitability. Turning your gaze toward the corridor, your eyes traced the jagged edges of peeling plaster where the grime clung stubbornly, dim light failing to soften the stubborn shadows. Each step you took echoed softly, a drawn-out thud against aged floorboards, hesitant yet insistent. The musty scent of vinegar, wood, and something more elusive, an undercurrent of cold fear mixed in the stale air, filling your lungs with each measured breath. The brittle hush of the shelter pressed inward, magnifying every small noise, the scrape of fabric, the faint rustle of shifting bodies, the distant the faint rustle of shifting bodies, the distant thousand echoes that stare endless over the thudding heartbeat of suppressed anxiety. Ahead, the shadows deepened where the narrow hallway met the next chamber. You hesitated briefly, fingers tightening around the rough edge of your blanket. It was your shield, your tether, your fragile armor against the weight of an invisible gaze. The faintest stir of thought flickered, held at bay by the slow ticking of your pulse. You reminded yourself that each movement, however slight, was in the stillness. You stepped forward, the worn soles of your shoes carrying you with deliberate slowness. With each footfall, you felt the impression of cracked linoleum beneath you, the texture uneven and cold, a quiet reminder that this place was carved from endurance. The faint murmur of distant voices floated through the air, quiet as breath, clipped and careful replies, exchanged like secrets never meant to escape. Somewhere nearby, a chair protested softly against the floor as it shifted, adding another thread to the tapestry of restrained sound. You moved deeper into the room where the registry awaited. The dim illumination from a single flickering bulb casting a sickly yellow hue over the faces huddled in place. They were ghosts in a mosaic of muted weariness, eyes lowered or fixed, on some invisible point beyond the crumbling walls. The thin fabric of their worn clothing clung to hunched shoulders. Shadows pooling in the hollows beneath tired cheekbones. The air was thick with a blend of stale tobacco, undercooked rice, and the faint metallic sting of disinfectant, hanging like a fragile barrier between past and present. As you reached the back of the room, you found a space on a battered bench, the wooden surface splintered in places from years of quiet waiting. The cold seeped through the thin fabric beneath you, a stubborn chill rooted deep in the bones, reminding you of the long hours ahead. You adjusted the blanket around your shoulders, its rough edges pressing into your skin in a familiar rhythm. Rough, uneven, grounding. Around you the ritual unfolded with haunting predictability. Names called in soft succession, barely loud enough to penetrate the thick air. Each response a thread woven into a slow, trembling fabric of existence. The subtle scrape of footsteps came and went, swallowed quickly by the heavy silence. You watched the faint patterns of dust motes caught in the weak beam of light near the ceiling, drifting like slow ghosts in timeless suspension. The world felt paused, held steady on a breath too long drawn. A distant bell tolled once, its hollow echo resonating through the cramped space, a somber reminder of hours that slipped by unnoticed. Somewhere near, an involuntary cough pierced the stillness, muffled quickly, as if shameful. You shifted, fingers tightening on the blanket's frayed edge again and again, weaving an invisible tapestry of courage and quiet endurance. The eyes around you held stories you could neither hear nor see, the weight of invisible suffering, of hopes folded beneath the daily grind of silence. You felt a gentle tremor at the edges of your awareness, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if the you watching. Then the figure from the doorway stepped quietly to your side, their presence a thin thread stretched taut in the space between you. The cautious glance they cast was a question written without words, the faintest spark of something unspoken flickering in their gaze. Their hand slid from the place where it had rested briefly, and now hovered near a small slip of paper. A token, perhaps, or a message veiled in cautious hope. You swallowed the tight knot rising in your throat, and met their eyes with steady calm. The rune seemed to slow even further, the slow drip of time folding softly as you leaned in just a fraction. Their fingers brushed yours, not quite a touch, more an acknowledgement, and the air pulsed softly, like the faint thrum of a distant heartbeat. Before you could respond, the door at the far end creaked open again, admitting a sliver of colder light that stretched sharp and pale across the cracked floor. Shadows tossed and twisted in the narrow beam, carrying with them the long, silent weight of what was waiting beyond. A chill skated slowly down your spine as your gaze caught movement just beyond the threshold. A figure emerging hesitantly from the dimness, eyes shadowed, yet fixed intently upon you. The subtle nod they gave was almost imperceptible, but in it lay a promise. The path ahead was no longer just one of muted endurance. It was a door thrown open into something uncertain but alive. You felt the faintest murmur ripple through the gathered crowd, like a low tide pulling inward on a shore of quiet desperation. And somewhere deep beneath your ribs, an unfamiliar pulse stirred, a slow rhythm promising change, fragile but undeniable. You took a measured step forward, the worn wood creaking beneath, and caught your breath. The next moment waited, hanging on the thinnest thread, as the whispered name, soft and urgent, escaped once more into the waiting air. You stepped back from the door, the cold wood imprinting a faint tremor into your palm as the rough grain dug softly beneath your fingertips. Outside, the shelter's tight, weighted silence deepened. Each breath now a measured act, every creak of floorboards a fragile thread woven into the tension that wrapped itself around you. The murmurs, so faint before, seemed to dissolve into the shadows, leaving open a space thick with quiet anticipation. Turning toward the corridor, your eyes traced the peeling plaster's jagged edges, where grime gathered stubbornly, the dim light falling short of softening the chill in those corners. With each step, the worn floorboards sighed beneath your weight, their hollow groan like a slow, weary exhale against the stillness. The sharp scent, a vinegar, mingled with the faint hint of damp earth, lingering stubbornly in the stale air that filled your lungs as you moved forward. Deliberate, steady, as if urging the world itself to match your slow rhythm. The narrow hallway stretched ahead, tight and shadowed, the faintest outline of cracked linoleum under your shoes, a reminder of the countless footsteps that had come before you. Somewhere close, a chair protested quietly, dragged across the floor with careful reluctance, the sound folding into the mix of soft murmurs and whispered breaths. The air held a thread of cold fear, subtle but unshakable, curling around the backs of your neck and shoulders as the weight of unspoken watchfulness pressed in. You pressed your fingers lightly to the frayed edge of your blanket, a rough, uneven shield that never failed to comfort, no matter how much it pinched and prickled your skin. It was a small, steady thing that reminded you still held on to some fragment of normalcy amid the uncertainty. Your pulse beat slow but insistent, marking time in tandem with your footsteps as you neared the door to the registry room. A low portal to a place of ritual and unseen scrutiny. Steeling yourself, you slipped your hand toward the worn wooden handle. The grain was splintered and cold, each ridge a map of years spent, bearing the weight of unspoken stories. A faint quiver traced along your fingers, barely perceptible, as you turned the handle and pushed the door open, just enough to slip inside. The dim light spilled over faces bent low, shadows pulling the contours of tired eyes that held none of your own hope. but all of their quiet endurance. The scent wrapped you immediately. Bitter rice mixed with the sharp sting of disinfectant, underscored by the sour tang of damp fabric and the faint ghost of tobacco smoke fading into the corners. Your breath caught at the fragile balance of this place, its worn linoleum floor rattling softly beneath cautious footsteps. The low murmur of names called and answered, like a chant, broken only by the irregular scrape of chairs and the ever-present whisper of time stretched thin. You found a narrow space at the back, a battered wooden bench scarred by countless waiting bodies, its cold surface reminding you how each person carried their own thread of this shared burden. Settling slowly, you adjusted the rough blanket again, feeling the uneven fabric press against your arms. Around you, the soft cadence flowed, names falling like gentle echoes into the thick silence, each answered in careful whispers, as if louder sounds might shatter the fragile web holding this place together. Above, the small window near the ceiling offered the faintest glimmer of muted light, casting dust motes that danced, weightless and slow, through the stale air. It was a quiet dance, almost hypnotic in its repetition, drawing your gaze upward and inward, where the outside world felt impossibly distant and suspended, like a breath held tight between two heartbeats. A slow toll punctuated the quiet, a distant bell ringing once, low and hollow, its sound stretching lazily across the room, merging with the muffled cough that followed swiftly, a sharp, stifled sound swallowed quickly by pressing lips and the collective tension. You gripped the blanket's frayed edges lightly once more, the roughness grounding you, drawing out the knit of your presence in this web of quiet endurance. Eyes shifted occasionally, shadows playing across faces that told stories of silent suffering, an unreadable mix of resignation and vigilance lurking beneath heavy lids. A faint ripple passed like a whisper through the gathered crowd, the collective breath of many waiting, waiting for what none dared name, for what might tip the balance between fragility and collapse. Then, breaking the low hum of this tense stillness, the figure from the doorway reappeared beside you. Their presence was a quiet pulse of energy, a thread suddenly taut in the powdery air. Eyes met yours, holding a question unspoken, flickering with something harder to place: hope, warning, or perhaps an invitation too subtle to name. Their hand moved slowly, hesitating, at the edge of a small folded slip of paper, thin and worn, a secret tucked silently between fingers that trembled faintly. You swallowed the sharp knot gathered in your throat, stilling your breath as you reached out. Fingers brushed, a mere whisper of contact, barely holding the moment in place. The room seemed to lean in closer, the fragile swell of expectancy pressing gently against ribs, tightening with silent fear and unspoken resolve. Before you could pull away or ask what this fragile offering meant, the door at the far end creaked open. A thin slice of colder light piercing into the muted warmth. Shadows flickered sharply in that slender vein, twisting and stretching like slow fingers reaching toward you. Movement appeared. A figure stepped into the dim glow with hesitant certainty, their eyes fixed on you with an unreadable intensity. They gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but within that gesture lay a quiet promise. A promise that the path you took next would not simply be another stretch of muted endurance or soft, invisible battles in shadow. It was the opening of a door long sealed into something precarious, unknown, but unmistakably alive. The faintest murmur stirred the room, a ripple subtle as a breeze over still water. Somewhere deep, unseen vibrations trembled beneath your ribs, awakening a pulse with the slow beat of fragile change. You drew a breath and took a small, steady step forward, and in the hollow between one heartbeat and the next, the whispered name came again, soft, urgent, threading through the air like a fragile thread, pulling at the seams of everything you had come to accept. You took a slow breath, the quiet weight of the moment settling deep in your chest, like a stone pressed carefully into soft earth. The faint nod from the stranger who had stepped into the light lingered in your mind, a fragile promise folded between the shadows of the registry room and the narrow corridor beyond. Your feet shifted lightly on the cracked floor, the worn linoleum biting cold through your thin shoes, grounding you in the stretch of time stretched taut before you. The air carried a sharp edge, a subtle tremor you could almost trace with your fingertips, an undercurrent of watchfulness weaving through the muted murmurs around you. Voices had softened, swallowed by the tension pressing like thick fog between the worn wooden benches and the cracked plaster walls. Every breath became a deliberate act, every heartbeat a slow drum in the hollow silence. You felt the weight of many eyes, unseen but felt, anchors in the sea of quiet desperation, holding you steady. Your fingers tightened around the blanket once more, its rough fibers scratching gently against your skin, a familiar thread in this tapestry of waiting. You glanced upward toward the small window that barely split the grimy glass, where pale light caught the dust wafting through the still air, each particle drifting in a slow, restless dance. For a moment, that softened the edges of your unease, a whisper of calm in the endless gray. Each step away from the door was measured, a choreography of restraint and resolve. You moved through the room with careful awareness, the floorboards groaning softly beneath your weight, as if the shelter itself sighed at the burden it bore. The faint scent of undercooked rice and stale smoke tangled with the sharper notes of disinfectant and the sour tang of damp fabric, all mingling into a scent you had grown to know as the breath of survival. Passing the tired faces, clustered in quiet groups, you caught fragments of whispered names, the inevitable echoes of existence, flashed briefly and then folded back into silence. You noted the slight tremble in a hand resting on a worn cane, the uneven rise and fall of shallow breaths, the nervous glance cast toward narrow doorways, and you recognized in each a shared thread of hope, fear, and enduring patience. Somewhere nearby, a chair scraped softly against the floor, unnoticed by most, but ringing clear in your ears. The sound undulated through the thick air, carrying with it a fleeting pulse of restless energy. You swallowed the tight knot forming in your throat, feeling the ache settle and spread. A slow burn beneath ribs that ached with the weight of quiet resolve. You bent slightly to adjust the blanket again, its texture prickling your forearm like a whisper that could either soothe or unsettle. The roughness was a constant, grounding you against the slow creep of cold that clung to the corners of this room like a living thing. A flicker of warmth broke through the gloom as one of the small lights above flickered uncertainly. A brief pulse of yellow against shadowed faces before dimming once more. Your gaze fell to the slip of paper, still held loosely in the stranger's hand beside you. A thin, fragile shard of possibility. Their eyes held a cautious invitation, the kind that did not speak, but pressed insistently beneath the surface. You hesitated, fingers trembling barely perceptibly, caught between the steady pulse of your own breath and the unfolding moment. A soft murmur stirred the room as heads turned slowly toward the narrow door at the far end, where a faint breeze slipped through the crack beneath. The temperature shifted slightly, colder now, as if the air itself held its breath, carrying whispers from beyond the walls. You felt the hairs on your neck rise gently, a slow shiver trailing down your spine, the weight of unseen eyes drawing tighter, more focused. Beyond the door, a subtle movement caught your peripheral vision, a shadow folding into itself, and then unfolding again, like a slow, waking breath. The stranger beside you glanced briefly, their gaze sharp but unreadable, lips pressed in a thin line. The presence was thin but undeniable, threading through the room like a low hum, vibrating against the skin of silence. You turned your attention back to the paper in your own hands now, its edges frayed and worn, as if touched by 100 other waiting moments. The weight of it pressed lightly into your palm, fragile but resistant. You tore your eyes away slowly, feeling the steady cadence of your heartbeat mingling with the rhythm of the quiet footsteps weaving through the aisles. Suddenly, the bell tolled once more, low and somber, a sound that seemed to ripple from the depths of the shelter itself. The echo rolled through the room, folding against faces bathed in shadow, sweeping away the last wisps of fading light. You inhaled deeply, the scent of damp wood and bitter rice filling your lungs as the moment hung, trembling, between what was and what might come next. Your muscles coiled and released with a weight that was neither panic nor peace. Time itself felt thin here, stretched and fragile, waiting to snap or mend with the faintest pressure. The whispered name, barely audible, but carried steadily on the gathered breath, brushed past your ear again. Soft, urgent, a thread pulling you forward. You stepped closer to the door, feeling the rough grain beneath your fingertips once again, tracing its history of countless hands and countless stories. Your breath caught, slow and steady, as the sliver of cold light spilling through the crack widened imperceptibly. The air shifted, and the shadowed figure from before stepped further into the gray, their eyes locking onto yours with a weight that folded space between you. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the fragile cord stretched taut would finally pull free. And as your hand curled lightly around the doorframe, the whispered name came again, the soft unfolding of something new, a fragile thread unraveling quietly in the stale air. This time, you did not hesitate. You stepped away from the door slowly, the cool wood imprinting a faint pressure into your palm, as the rough grain whispered traces of countless hands before yours. The air in the shelter thickened, folding over itself like a heavy, damp cloth clinging to your skin. Every breath you drew seemed slower here, laden with the weight of unseen eyes. The faint murmurs and soft shuffles around you tapered off, swallowed by the growing stillness, as if the muted crowd itself was holding its breath. Your footsteps traced a measured path along the cracked linoleum corridor, each step a soft thud that the floorboards accepted with reluctant groans. The sharp tang of vinegar mingled with stale tobacco and the faint, metallic bite of rusted hinges. Your lungs filled with the thick, humid air, tasting the mixture of damp wood and the bitter residue of fatigue. The corridor narrowed ahead, shadowed edges pressed close, where peeling plaster clung stubbornly to the walls, holding the weariness of forgotten years. You crossed the threshold of the small common room, a cramped enclave of weary bodies wrapped in threadbare blankets, clustered like fragile islands in this sea of quiet. The low, flickering light leaned weakly over hunched shoulders and downcast eyes, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched and folded upon cracked faces. The scent of boiled rice, faint and unchanging, lingered as a dull promise beneath the sharper, sour notes of sweat and too many days locked inside. You found your place along the chipped wooden bench at the back, lowering yourself slowly so the thin fabric of your shirt brushed against the splintered surface. The bench protested softly beneath your weight, a tired creak swallowed quickly by the thick stillness. Firm fingers gripped the rough blanket around your shoulders, seeking warmth in the coarse weave that pricked and comforted like a familiar wound. The air here carried the quiet before the storm, a taut, electric tension curled just beneath calm. Around you a delicate ripple of movement passed, The subtle exchange of glances, the soft shifting of restless bodies, the quick inhale stifled by long practice. The names echoed again, barely rising above the hush, each syllable falling like a drop into a deep well of silence. Responses came in whispers, measured and gentle, stretching languidly into the thick space. The lull of voices folded softly into the shadowed corners. A repeated litany of existence woven from the threadbare memories of this place. Your gaze drifted upward, catching the pale shaft of light sneaking through the grimy window. A shaft so thin and cool, it seemed almost unreal. Dust motes floated languidly, spinning slow dances that defied time, drifting like ghostly embers caught in frozen breath. For a moment you followed their gentle arcs, letting the quiet lull your racing heart. The distant bell tolled once more, slow and hollow, each chime a measured beat pulsing out into the heavy air. Its sound bounced off splintered walls and cracked plaster, resonating deep within your chest. Somewhere nearby, a cough pierced the silence, a sharp, stifled interruption quickly swallowed by the pressed lips and guarded breaths that surrounded you. The soft, uneven rhythm of breath and murmurs continued, the fragile hum that held the shelter together. A shadow moved just beyond your edge of sight, a familiar figure returning quietly from the doorway. Their presence rippled gently through the stillness, the faint stir of air marking their cautious approach. They settled beside you without a word, their eyes searching yours with a flicker that held more meaning than any voice could carry. In their hand, a small slip of paper rested like a secret, its edges soft and worn from unseen hands clutching it too long. You extended your fingers, your touch a near whisper, and the paper slid into your grasp, a fragile promise folded into the crease of your palm. The texture was thin and brittle, the faded ink faded and indecipherable to anyone else, but heavy with the weight of intention. An unspoken pact settled between you, threading your shared breath into the quiet fold of the room. Your shoulders rose and fell slightly, releasing a slow exhale as the moment lingered, taut and humming with the unspoken. Then, from the far corner, the creak of a door stirred the thick silence anew. A pale strip of colder light cut through the gloom, slipping cautiously across the scarred floor like a narrow finger. Shadows twisted and unfolded in that sliver, hinting at movement beyond the walls you had come to know so well. You turned your eyes toward the shifting darkness. A figure stepped slowly into the thin light, their features blurred but framed by uncertainty and resolve. Their glance cut through the dim, locking onto yours in a silent exchange heavy with unvoiced truths. The faintest nod passed between you, a gesture so slight it threatened to melt away like mist, but carried the weight of a beginning. The room seemed to breathe in unison, the fragile web of quiet expectation tangling thicker with each passing heartbeat. The murmurs flowed like a tide at the shore, soft and tentative, weaving through the hollow spaces beneath ribs and between fingers clutching rough fabric. Something new stirred, an ember glowing faintly beneath ash, waiting for a breath strong enough to ignite it. Your skin prickled with the cold, the distant scent of burnt wood threading through the stale air, mingling with the sour bitterness that lingered close. The blanket pulled tighter around your shoulders, its rough edges digging faintly into your skin, anchoring you despite the whisper of change curling just beyond this moment. Each breath you took grew heavier, the slow pulse inside you quickening imperceptibly as you stepped forward. The worn floorboards yielded beneath your weight, the faint groans folding into the deepening silence, a quiet chorus that marked the passage into what awaited. Your hand brushed the doorframe again, the grain cool beneath your palm, etched with the memories of countless fingers before yours. Time faltered, stretched thin and fragile, hanging between the steady drum of your heartbeats. The whispered name, soft and urgent, wove itself once more through the dense air, threading a fragile promise along the edge of your consciousness. The door creaked wider, the sliver of light blossoming into a narrow path, stretching beyond the shadows you had known. You inhaled slowly, the chill brushing deep into your lungs, and stepped inside. The next step was no longer a passage into silence, but into the unforgiving dawn of what was to come. You moved away from the door in slow, measured steps, your palm lingering briefly on the rough wood, its chill seeping deep beneath your skin. The shelter seemed to exhale, the thick silence swelling around you like a heavy fog settling over hollow streets at dawn. Each breath you drew was deliberate, pulling in the scent of damp earth, stale tobacco smoke, and faint traces of vinegar folded into the air. Your footsteps spoke softly against the floorboards, hollow echoes that held the weight of unseen histories buried in cracked linoleum and splintered wood. The corridor stretched ahead, narrow and dark, shadows pooling like ink along the cracks in peeling plaster. The light, faint and grim, flickered intermittently from a weak bulb overhead, casting long, wavering shapes that drifted slowly as if carried by a silent current. Your gaze caught the pale glint of dust motes, stirred by your movement, drifting and swirling in the still air like slow embers caught in a breath held too long. The chill crept upward, curling around your ankles and stealing warmth from thin fabric and skin alike. You tightened your grip on the coarse blanket wrapped around your shoulders, the rough texture prickling against your arms, an anchor amid the still and fragile world pressing in. The scent of boiled rice lingered faintly, mingling with the sharper sting of disinfectant and the bitter tang of sweat that clung to heavy bodies resting just beyond the walls. Somewhere distant, a chair scraped softly, the sounds swallowed quickly by the thick air. Like a secret fading into forgotten places, your feet traced familiar patterns, hesitant, careful, a slow march through layers of quiet expectation. Faces materialized briefly in the dim, shadowed alcoves of the shelter, eyes averted, mouths pressed tight, bodies folded into themselves as if trying ever more fiercely to occupy less space. The atmosphere pulsed with a dense collective breath, held tight and ready to shatter at the slightest misstep. The faint murmur of whispered names floated at the edges of your hearing, voices soft and tentative, weaving threads of survival that connected every heart in the room. Ahead, the door to the registry room loomed, a threshold between remembered pasts and fragile futures. You paused, fingers brushing the splintered wood, tracing the familiar grooves shaped by countless others who had crossed the same boundary. The weight of unseen eyes settled over you again, an oppressive tide pressing at your skin and forcing a slow, steadying breath. The room beyond held its own secrets, quiet choreography of glances, half-hushed conversations, tangled with the scent of old paper and the metallic pinch of rust. You stepped forward once more, each footfall a drawn-out sound, careful not to fracture the brittle calm. A thin beam of light reached from the window high above, cutting across cracked plaster and illuminating a swirl of dust in slow, breathtaking spirals. The faint warmth of that light was a betrayal, a reminder of the vast, your compressed existence, suspended like a fragile hope just beyond reach. It pressed softly against your face, enough to awake ache and longing buried beneath layers of silent endurance. Inside the registry room, the air was thick with anticipation. The murmurs folded over one another, a quiet tide pulsing through gathered bodies. You found your place along the wooden bench at the back, the rough surface biting fatally into your skin through thin clothes, the chill sinking deep into your bones, the coarse blanket pressed in again, uneven and persistent, a comfort and a burden all at once. Around you, the ritual unfolded in a slow rhythm. Names echoed softly in an endless loop, each response nearly swallowed by the dense stillness. The faint scrape of chairs, the quiet shuffle of feet, the near imperceptible intake of breath, sounds woven into the steady fabric of waiting. Every detail was magnified, stretched, lingering in the space between heartbeats as the minutes, hours, stretched thin and slow. The scent of undercooked rice hovered still, battling with stale smoke and the acrid sharpness of disinfectant, forming the shelter's constant, aching perfume. The small window near the ceiling offered a glimpse of a gray, unyielding sky. Dust motes danced there, tracing slow, hypnotic arcs, seeming to defy every measure of time in their languid fall. Your eyes followed, letting the movement cradle your thoughts, slow and undemanding, an island of stillness amid the pressing tension. A bell tolled, low and deliberate, reverberating through the room like the deep pulse of some ancient drum, each chime smoothing the rough edges of waiting, drawing the collective breath tighter still. Somewhere close, a cough slipped past lips pressed firmly together, punctuating the hush with stifled urgency. You gripped the blanket's rough fabric, fingers curling into its worn threads in a silent plea for endurance. Then the figure who had emerged from the doorway earlier returned, moving quietly to your side. Their eyes held questions unfathomable, simmering beneath cautious resolve. In their hand rested the small slip of paper, thin, fragile, worn, bearing a secret carried long and carefully passed now into your possession. The subtle exchange of your fingertips with theirs was a whisper of trust, barely audible but charged with meaning. The room held its breath with you as the door at the far end shifted again, a faint creak splitting the still air. Cold light spilled through the gap, sharp and pale, slicing across the worn floor. Shadows flared and collapsed in the narrow beam, rippling with sinister grace. Your gaze caught the figure stepping from the shadow, a silhouette both uncertain and resolute, eyes locked onto yours with a quiet intensity that carved the stillness into two. A slight nod passed between you, hesitant yet deliberate, a silent pact forged in the calibers of understanding and need. Around you, the temperature seemed to shift in subtle gradations, the faintest ripple coursing through the gathered crowd as if stirred by some unseen tide. The old walls creaked softly, heavy with barely suppressed emotion and the fragile weight of unfolding change. Your breath caught as the whispered name came closer again, flung softly into the air, like a thread pulling taut at the seams of the shelter. The moment poised, fragile and shimmering, balanced delicately against the inevitable. And as your hand closed firmly around the doorframe, time itself seemed to hold still, waiting, before finally letting go. You stepped through the door, the thin sliver of light embracing you like a quiet hand, guiding you out of shadow. The registry room held its breath with you, the lingering weight of muffled faces and whispered names folding softly into the space you moved through. The rough wooden bench creaked beneath you as you settled again, the familiar chill pressing gently against your skin through the thin fabric. The slip of paper you held felt impossibly fragile in your palm, a threadbare connector to something beyond these gray walls, beyond the quiet endurance that had settled around you like winter's hush. The room's stale air mingled the scent of cold rice with faint tobacco, old wood, and something sharper. Hope, unspoken but hovering just beneath the surface. Around you, the ritual continued, names drifting softly through the room, answered in breathy responses that tethered this fragile community together. Each voice a testament to survival, each silence a lasting echo of shared struggle. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle shift had taken hold, a delicate pulse threading through the collective, like the first hesitant notes of a long-forgotten song stirring from sleep. The figure who had slipped beside you offered a quiet nod, eyes glinting with an unvoiced understanding. Their presence seemed heavier now, a weight that settled like a promise. The air between you felt charged, not with fear, but with a deep calm. A moment pregnant with all that had been born silently, and all that still might be. Outside the window, the faint gray light filtered in, softened by a gentle rain beginning to fall. It tapped quietly against the grime, a soothing rhythm that mingled with distant echoes of the bell tolling softly, marking time not with urgency, but with steady patience. The rain's cool breath seeped into the cracks of the shelter, mingling with the warmth pressed close beneath the blankets, and the steady breath of those who waited alongside you. In this shared stillness, the edges of fear and fatigue began to blur, worn smooth by endurance. The whispered name drifted once more through the air, no longer just a frail echo, but a beckoning thread, folding into the moment with soft insistence. You lifted your eyes, meeting those around you, faces worn but not broken, eyes dimmed but steady, holding within them stories that stretched beyond these walls. And among them, you saw the silent acknowledgement of what this moment meant. Not an end, but the slow unfurling of a path forward. Your fingers tightened gently around a slip of paper. It was more than a message. It was an invitation, a fragile bridge crossing between hidden fears and the possibility of change. The room's quiet murmur folded into a collective breath, held and released, a slow surrender to the unknown. Slowly, you rose. The worn wood beneath your blankets slipped from your shoulders, a soft shield now folded and tucked away. The figure at your side offered a hand, not just in greeting, but in unspoken solidarity, and you took it without hesitation. The contact was light, a spark that crackled softly, igniting something muted but unmistakable. Together, you stepped toward the narrow doorway, each step measured, deliberate. The air beyond the threshold awaited, cool, uncertain, yet filled with that faint pulse of promise. The rain pattered louder now, soft percussion setting a rhythm to your advancing steps. As you crossed the threshold, the crowd behind you exhaled in unison, the collective tension releasing like breath held too long. The narrow corridor stretched ahead, no longer a prison of silence, but a passage between what was endured and what might be embraced. You glanced back once, catching the faintest glimmer of understanding in the faces left behind. There was comfort in that shared endurance, a secret thread woven invisible but unbreakable. The door closed softly behind you, sealing the room in quiet calm. Your footsteps echoed faintly as you moved forward, the pulse in your chest steady but quickening. The whispered name faded into the distant hum of rain, carried away on the softened breeze. Outside, the gray light deepened into the velvet of evening, a slow darkness settling with gentle grace. The rain's song lingered, a lullaby for the weary, a promise for the dawn. And in the quiet unfolding that followed, you found a fragile peace, an end to the waiting and the silence, the beginning of something new, murmuring just beyond reach, waiting patiently for the life to come. With a gentle sigh, you let your shoulders fall, the weight of yesterday slipping away like shadows at twilight. The shelter of night embraced you softly, a balm to worn bones and restless thoughts. Your breath slowed, the stillness folding around you like a familiar song, swaying gently toward rest. The world outside, once distant and indifferent, seemed to hold you for a moment, tender and quiet, before slipping away into the vast, patient dark. Here, in this fragile calm, you closed your eyes. The day's burdens ebbed, the echo of whispered names settled into a soft hum, and the last drop of rain lingered on the skin like a cool caress. The story ended not with noise or blaze, but in the soft gathering of peace, a whispered promise carried on the wind, a gentle closing of eyes beneath the sheltering night. And as that calm deepened, you drifted toward the quiet lullaby of sleep, the heavy weight of silence now a gentle cradle. The night welcomed you home.